What shall we title
And
this?
I still haven't. So this is a workshop that is T and social anxiety. So the title is very specific on this one. Well, not just social anxiety, I should say, but just anxiety in general. So we're really going to dive into this topic. And the reason that I really wanted to create a module, as Jean has been putting it, and I like that. So we have modules for our library. And the reason I wanted to start with this module is because I can show how T will relate to issue, whatever issue is, whatever the issue is, or whatever we're looking at. So let's say, I don't know, Jean was just talking about body pain. So let's just say somebody is going through neuropathy, or they're going through, something where they have pain in their body. Well, we could have T and that. We could talk about that. And then we would have this, structure that I'm going to present today, and it would be with pretty much any topic. So let's say, depression, or today we talk about anxiety, or maybe anger. People have issues with anger, maybe addiction, alcoholism, drug addictions, things like this. So this is kind of a framework of how I think that T can apply to all of these different ailments or, situations.
No, in my interview on Monday, we have to do these behavioral interviews where they ask you questions about, how would you react in this situation? And then you have to provide a specific example. And they asked me a question, and at first I'm like, I'm not sure if my mind went to, I'm not sure if I've ever been in that situation, but I didn't go down the path of like, I have no answer for this and get into that, because then I wouldn't be able to answer the question if I'm thinking about how I can't answer it. So I gave myself a little bit of space. I checked into my body, my feet, my breath, and I was able to come up with an answer. So yeah, it's a good example of how T, when you apply the principles of T, you can relax your mind and not freak out in that situation, because in the past I would have just been like, I don't have an answer, So yeah, I was able to relax into it, and then an idea came to my mind.
Yeah, so that could even be a module, T in interviews, because there's all these little things that are really important to us. T in your career, T in the workplace. And so if we're going to look at anything, so today we're going to talk a little bit about anxiety. So I'm going to switch to my whiteboard here. And T and anxiety. Clicky, clicky. Now, the way that we would look at this as really anything is we're going to look at it through 4 different lenses, depending on where you are in the T practice. So if we have the first little area is basic alignment. This is the 4 aspects of T, the four main sections. Counterbalance, and after counterbalance is warrior training, and after warrior training is seer's training. And if you've never heard of any of these, that's okay, because we will talk a little bit about all of this a little bit today, because we're going to put T and anxiety into a full scope of a T practice. So if somebody is brand new, whoops, and I misspelled seers on that, but just pretend that was correct. That had a couple extra R's. So it really would just depend on how much somebody has been exposed to the T practice as to where, it will fit, where it will fit in with each of the 4 different sections. So let's take the anxiety for an example, and then I'll really start to break down what anxiety is and how T relates to, I like the word dissolving, because when it's not getting your attention, it just starts to disappear. You even forget that it was there at a certain point. You forget that you used to be anxious about this thing until you can't help but notice that you're responding differently. And then it's like, oh, oh, that's right. Like I used to respond to the situation in this way, and it's not happening right now. Like I can't help but notice that. And that usually is a good feeling too. It's like, like, ooh, things are changing, how I want them to. And that's nice. So let's say that somebody was interested in T and social anxiety or just regular anxiety. They're really close to the same thing. But let's say that somebody is interested in how T can help them. If they're brand new to the practice, I would recommend some basic alignment practices. So if they're brand new to T, and let's say, Ida is talking about how, she just wakes up and she feels really anxious, or right before work, she feels really anxious, or right before, dinner events with friends and family, she feels anxious. Well, if we were going to talk about basic alignment, because that's where Ida is in the T understanding, let's say, how much exposure to the T practice she's had so far, how much experience. Well, if it's not that much experience, I would just recommend maybe doing some fox walking right before the event. Maybe do a little 4 modes practice throughout the day. How about before you arrive at work or arrive at the dinner, do a little bit of deliberate driving. Have a deliberate beverage during the day. Create a mantra that's going to help you remember your fox walking practice or your 4 modes practice or your deliberate driving practice. If you find creative ways to remind yourself, that's awesome too. So if you start to maybe use objects of power, or if you use sticky notes or note cards, or you have a phone a friend where, somebody text messages you and says, hey, remember you're going to have that interview today. You're going to do awesome. Do your breathing, do your fox walking, pay attention, internal point of attention, external point of attention, and you'll crush it, just like Shayna was talking about with her interview. So if somebody was just now coming to the T practice, that is probably what I would recommend. Does that make sense? And now, is that going to dissolve anxiety, for the rest of their lives? No, it's not. So it's probably going to reoccur, but it could help, right? It could definitely be beneficial to a certain extent. Oh, let's see. Ida, mantra would be good in that scenario. Yeah, and power object in your pocket, right? And so that would still all be just basic alignment stuff. And I think we can all agree, at least in the beginning, that would still be beneficial to a certain extent. It would be fine. Does that make sense so far? And now what we could do is we could substitute anxiety with depression or worry or anger. Now, if somebody is really angry, take a walk. Start doing your practice a little bit before these situations that make you angry, such as driving. A little bit of deliberate driving. Remind yourself to deliberately drive. Have a deliberate beverage before, plan to have a deliberate beverage after to recenter yourself. These are things that people can do, and it doesn't really matter what the situation is or what they're looking to redirect or dissolve. The beginning is still the same beginning. Does that make sense? Carly, Karen, does that kind of... So essentially, it would just begin with the basic practices. That's what basic alignment is. It's just sensory attention training, really. And that's okay. It's going to help to a certain extent, and it will definitely help set up the rest of the T practice. If they start to do a little bit of fox walking, they're going to start to experience some of this stuff, and now that stuff could get really interesting. All right, so let's go ahead and the more you practice, the more you get better at it too. Exactly. Yeah. Bring the situation, the tool that you have accumulated to that point, right? And I'll show that a little bit more as we go along. How anxiety can be framed in one of these 4 categories of T, depending on where you are in your T practice, and that's completely your garden. If you want to have a one-on-one session, and we can talk about where do you think in these 4 phases, where you are, we could talk about that a little bit, but where you are. I'm putting that in air quotes, I have to. Okay, so first of all, if we talk a little bit about what anxiety is. So, you know, I can look this up and I can check academia, and it's always going to come up to something that has to do with chemicals and hormones in our body. So I can talk about anxiety in 3 different ways. I can talk about it in terms of psychologically and the mind, physically and the body, and then third, the spirit, how anxiety and the spirit relate. But just like T, you know, it really doesn't matter what we're looking to address, there's a framework. Well, this framework is also applicable to everything. So let's say that you're smoking or overeating or watching too much TV. These 3 are a factor: your mind, your physical body, your biology, and also the spirit. And I'm going to talk about the spirit here in a second. I'm going to break that one down. So all 3 of these will always apply to whatever it is that we're looking to redirect, whether it's social situations, social anxiety, or, you know, we're having problems at home with the family, we're not communicating well, and, you know, maybe we find our mind looking at other desires and we forget about other things that are going on in our life. You know, our attention is a leaf at the mercy of the wind, sometimes maybe. So we have 2 different frameworks that we're working with. We have the 4 aspects of T, which is basic alignment, counterbalance, warrior training, and seers training. And no matter what the ailment is or whatever it is that we're looking at, it is always going to have these 3 aspects involved: psychology and the mind, biology and your body, and spirit, the unseen aspect of the human experience. Does that make sense so far, that framework? Hey, Mike, you just got here, but did that make sense? A little bit of framework around whatever it is, whatever the ailment, whatever the issue, whatever's bothering you. We have this framework that we can put it under, you know, a lens to make it come into focus so that we can understand it a little bit better.
Makes sense.
Whoops. Just as you were about to talk, you muted. But.
Oh, no, I said makes sense. Yes.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Repeat the second mode. So we have of the four phases of T, or the 3 aspects. So we have the 4 phases of T, which are basic alignment, and then we have counterbalance, and then we have warrior training, and then what I call seers training. So those are the 4 aspects of T, and then no matter what it is that we're looking to address or what it is that we're looking to maybe change. Maybe that's the way we're looking at it right now. We want to change, you know, maybe we're eating way too much before bed and we're looking to change that. Maybe the dentist says that we need to brush 3 times a day and we're only doing it once, so we want to change that. This is not cognitive behavioral therapy, but we will look at it in terms of psychology, biology, and spirit. Those 3 things are always going to be working together, and it's always going to be a factor in whatever we're doing. So I'll start with spirit, because that is the number 1 issue. And this is maybe something that has never been said quite the way that I'm going to say it. I don't know. But the spirit is unbalanced in the human experience commonly. And the reason is because the mind is not used to paying attention and engaging the present moment where all of this spirit and all of this potential energy exists. Potential energy, potential, exists right now. It's happening and is being expressed and is moving and changing and transferring and coiling all right now. That is occurring. And we are taking part in that. And the spirit of the mountain is when we engage the mountain. The spirit of the bedroom is when we engage the bedroom. The spirit of loving connection is when we engage the present moment. And because the human mind is so used to turning its attention in on its own cognition, we have become dumb, deaf, and blind to the spirit around us, where we're basically creating this film between us and essence, between us and a loving, vibrant connection to all things. So because of what we're doing, we're creating an atrophy effect. We're creating basically a regression in human evolution to the point where it could be very hard for us moving forward as a species to connect to spirit and the world around us. So because of that factor alone, we find ourselves in all of these issues: depression, anxiety, hatred, jealousy, envy, all of these things that are not very elegant. You know, it's not very evolved, you know, for the human species to be killing one another when we're already at the top of the food chain. That literally makes no sense. It has no evolutionary purpose. It's just insanity. And we're expressing that because of that. We are not connected to the spirit of the world, to the spirit of the universe itself. Does that make sense? Even our own spirit, paying attention to our own body, we're not even sensing into that commonly in the common mind. The common mind has turned its attention in on its problems, on its trying to figure it out, on its comparing and contrasting, careers, things, stuff, all of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think I've heard it said that way before. I wrote it down.
Oh, well, so that maybe is something to expect when we do have these little, what are we calling them? Modules, but they're almost like workshops. When they're live, they're like workshops. When you rewatch them, they're like modules. So they have two phases. And so there are probably going to be some things that are a little bit on the cutting edge, you know, a little bit that we haven't ever talked about before. So just like organizing it in this way, no matter what it is that we're looking to redirect or change or dissolve, if you're looking to have that from your life forever. So the first factor, and it's always the most important factor actually, is that our spirit is unbalanced. Our spirit is unbalanced because our mind and our attention is just constantly turned in on our own cognition, comparing and contrasting. What are they thinking about? What are they doing? What should they be doing? How should they be acting? And so that is always going to be something that we would want to address first. And that's what T does actually. T addresses that spiritual imbalance before we even look at the mind and look at the body. Does that make sense so far? And so Gene said that he agreed. We've never really heard it said in that way before, but I don't care what the ailment is. Whatever the ailment is, it is a fundamental result. This is the core. This is the root, as Jerry was talking about. The spirit is imbalanced because of that. And we automatically start to re-engineer and reverse engineer that with the T practice. Okay, so if we're going to look at it this way, now we're talking about anxiety, but it doesn't really matter what we're talking about because we'll always be talking about it in terms of basic alignment, counterbalance, warrior training, seers training. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about hydrostasy. That would look a lot like, well, Ernest, what are you doing right now about social situations? And so I would have to talk about hydrostasy because that's my practice right now. So basic alignment, counterbalance, warrior training, seers training. Just imagine seers is spelled correctly if you don't mind. And then we're always going to look at it in terms of, and I'm going to start with the number one thing, spirit. That's the number one thing. Number two and number three are closely related. And when I say mind, I also mean psychology. And when I say body, I also mean biology. Right? So if we're experiencing anxiety in our life experience, number one, our spirit is unbalanced. I can guarantee you. I can find that in if you have a one-on-one with me, I'll find where spirit is unbalanced. And what I mean by that is I will find where your attention is so turned in on your own cognition that you're missing the spirit and the essence of the world inside of you and the world around you, and the connection between the two. But we still have those two other factors. So if we're looking at anxiety, anxiety has a psychological factor. The psychological factor is, drum roll please, Jerry, the thinking, the direction of our own cognition and how we're thinking about things. So obviously how we're thinking about the interview, before the interview and in the interview. And so Ida said that she likes talking about spirit. So we will, because in every, thing that we can think of, whatever the ailment is, the three are an essential factor. And we talk about spirit much more when we get into seers training. As we start to move down the line, the language starts to change a little bit, and that's fine. It's building upon, it's not replacing anything. So everything that I'm doing right now with hydrostasy is built upon basic alignment and the principles of the four corners of T. So if we look at anxiety, there is that psychological factor. And that's the one that we love to talk about the most. It's easy to talk about. So where is our thinking before the interview, during the interview? How many times have we been in a situation and the mind is just moving and we're not paying attention to the people talking, we're not paying attention to anything going on around us, because the light of our attention is again disconnected from spirit and it's turned in on its own cognition, and in a way that is a gross disproportional imbalance. It's not like that's never supposed to happen, but it's happening way too much. That's why I say the spirit is unbalanced, because of the psychology, where our mind is directed. So if we look at anxiety in terms of psychology, it will be directly proportional to where your attention is, and whether your attention is turned in on thought or whether your attention is engaging, and that's the third pillar, the world around you. And then the biology of anxiety is the spider's web. So let's say, Jean, if you don't mind, I'm just going to use you as an example because your camera's on. But let's say that Jean has had 30 or 40 years of severe social anxiety where he doesn't go out, he doesn't enjoy, talking to people, he doesn't want to do interviews, he doesn't like new events and new things, he just wants to stay home where he's comfortable, where he feels safe, and he doesn't want to do any of those things. Well, that's a spider's web in this analogy. That's his web. That's what he's created. That's not exactly probably what he intended to create. That's not really his desire. But if his mind has been a leaf at the mercy of the wind, there it is. That's what you got so far. And then we look at it, we're like, oh, fuck, I guess I did create that. Sometimes that's what that psychiatrist does, is they help you take a step back to see what web you've woven so far. And then they want to take you into that webbing. And now that's where I say time out. I don't need to do that. I'll just start creating a more elegant web starting right now. And yeah, Shana, that creates that comfort zone. So let's say, that Jean has done that. Well, a lot of the anxiety has now moved and spread. And I'm using those words very loosely, okay? Because it's not really, we don't have to imagine that literally. It's spreading like a, infection. But in a manner of speaking, because of the cognition and because of the spirit being fundamentally imbalanced almost all of the time in the common mind, they're bored and at odds with the present moment, fundamentally. That's why the common mind requires so much entertainment, because it's bored with the moment. The spirit is unbalanced. The mind is dwelling on itself far too much in gross disproportional means. It's just happening all of the time, from the time a person wakes up, from the time a person goes to bed. Commonly, they're thinking about themselves in some way, one way or another, the whole time. Even when they're doing a degree of paying attention, there's still typically a lot of cognition occurring. So that's very common. So yeah, so our memory would have to do with our psychology. So that could be where we're thinking, and then if we're talking about anxiety, we would be taking memories and projecting them into the future, because psychologically, anxiety is a future projection. It's a future thought. And in the body, it's a reaction to something that we think could be damaging to us in the future or cause us pain in the future. So that would look a little bit like PTSD, or it would look a little bit like a bodily reaction to something like hyperventilating when you're in that situation. And then the cognition and the body will start to feed one another. The mind will make the body response worse, or if we're doing T, it can break that cycle, but we'll get to that. So does that make sense so far? Those three aspects, psychologically in the mind, biologically in the body, and then also the spirit. Fundamentally, if we can correct spirit, mind, and body will start to align on their own. That's what T is about. So it doesn't matter what it is, overeating or undereating or anxiety or depression or anger or any of these things, we have to look at it with those three aspects involved. And now what popular psychology wants to do is they want to, if you're in cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that, they want to focus on the mind. All right, so we're gonna fix the mind. I'm gonna tell you how to think, and we're gonna change the way that we're thinking. We're gonna reprogram the way that we're thinking. We're gonna positively reinforce the way that we're thinking, and we're gonna go from this thinking to better thinking. And I have thoroughly rejected that model. So the other aspect is the body, and that would start to look like pharmacology, where now we're starting to take pills, or we're starting to do, different substances and different things to change the chemistry and the chemical reactions that are occurring in the body, because anxiety is a chemical reaction in your body. There are hormones being released when we're feeling that anxious state. And if we use the word state, now we're talking about moods and vibrations and stuff like that. So does that make sense? So we have those three lenses to look at. And if we're going to look at the four aspects of T, well, in the beginning, we'll just start with basic fox walking. So are you feeling angry? Gene, go for a walk. Go try that. Try walking and paying attention to how you sit and stand before you get into the trigger situations. Maybe have a mantra to remind you to do your fox walking and to do your deliberate beverage and to do your deliberate driving. Place reminders around you that can help you with that type of cognition to help direct your attention back to some of these basic alignment practices. And that's great. That will be very beneficial. But let's say that Ida, who is also feeling some, and I'm just using you as a random example, but she's also feeling some anxiety, but she's been practicing T for a while, maybe 6 months, and she's noticed that the walking helps. She notices that doing her 4 modes practice helps. Deliberate driving has been very beneficial for her. So she's noticing these things are really starting to, it's like, hey, when I do it, it works. Then we can start talking about the 4 factors of embodiment. So let's say, I'm talking to Ida and I say, well, what do you want? Like, what do you really want? And Ida's like, I want to feel better. I want to feel peace. I want to feel all of those things that come from peace. I want to feel spirit, essence, that magic that is underlining the present moment. I want to feel that. Well, now we can start to talk about embodiment. We can really start to talk about where is your mind all the time, and did you put it there? So if we start talking about the 4 factors of embodiment, is Ida going to have this unbending desire to feel peace? If so, well, you've been doing a little bit of fox walking, you've been doing a little bit of 4 modes practice, so you can see where not peace comes from. Not peace comes from an imbalanced spirit that has led to an imbalanced psychology that has helped feed an imbalance in the body. Do you see the chain reaction? And all that imbalance, Buddha, is what causes all the suffering and all that attachment and all of that spider's web that isn't so elegant. Make sense so far? Well, now because Ida has been practicing T, she's been doing her fox walking, now she's adding some of her own stuff. She has been doing mindful swimming and mindful training for mindful cold swimming. So now she's training for the event, and even in the event, now she's adding the T principles of deliberate attention. So now she has some T stuff, fox walking, foremost practice, deliberate beverage, and now she's adding some of her own stuff because she lives her own unique life. And that's what T does. T is applicable to you. I make suggestions because most of us walk. So it seems like a fair one to share that we can all talk about. So now Ida is doing her practice. She has found through her practice that all not peace is coming from the direction of her attention and her mind. And she wants nothing more than to feel better, to feel peace, to feel all of the things that are a virtue of that peace and that alignment and that non-resistance. She wants to be able to adapt to things without breaking down all the time, without going into all of the psychological drama when stuff is happening. We want to be more leaders, you know, we want to be more stable and shine our light brightly for everybody around us. We want to be that person in the room that, you know, has their shit together in emergency situations or whatever. So she has the unbending desire to feel peace. She knows where not peace comes from, and she decides to take responsibility and accountability for the direction of her mind. I think we're now ready for counterbalance and warrior training. So if Ida is still feeling anxiety and she's going to start some counterbalance, we're going to start talking about cognitive redirection therapy. We're going to start talking about the rule of three and the three-strike rule. Rapid redirection. We're going to start talking about substitute dialogue. We're going to start talking about all of these emergency things that we can do before the situation, after, or during, and then after the situation. So now we'll start talking about all of these redirection techniques that we talk about in T in relation to anxiety. And of course, we're going to start with spirit. Are you paying attention to the seat of spirit, which is the present moment? If you are, now we're starting to reconnect and realign that first factor. Now that our spirit is connecting to the present moment, where is your mind and did you put it there? Is your thinking functional and pointing towards the present moment? So this isn't cognitive redirection therapy necessarily, cognitive behavioral therapy. Got my initials mixed up. Because what we're doing is we're just going back to the practice. Hopefully what we're saying to ourselves will point back to the present moment in some way. That's really, so if it points back to the third pillar in the second ring, that's a really good mantra. That's a really good thing to be doing with your cognition as far as T practice is concerned. If you're saying something that makes you feel better, fine. I'm not going to reject that entirely. But if it's pointing back to the practice, that's something we can be doing when we're 110 years old. It will always be an accessible, valuable tool to us no matter what. And that makes it a much more valuable tool because we can use it in an infinite amount of situations. So Ida is now approaching her anxiety with the T practice. Basic alignment, she's been doing her fox walking. She's added a whole bunch of new practices that she has invented because she's a unique human being. And now she's starting to do the cognitive redirection of when she sees that she's thinking repetitive habitual thoughts that don't make her feel well, she redirects it back to the present moment. And she notices that that is really helping with the anxious state psychologically. And let's say that she wakes up and her body just instantly feels anxious. That's okay. Where is your mind and did you put it there? Redirect back to spirit. Redirect back to the third pillar. And so now we can address both with the redirection technique, the body and the mind, by paying attention to spirit. That's it. That's always what we're doing. Our attention is realigning with the present moment, which is where spirit exists. Does that make sense? And that's how it would look if we're in counterbalance. I would also add that if Ida is looking to dissolve and change her anxiety state, then I would recommend a little point of attention inside the body and a little point of attention outside of the body as often as you can remember throughout the day. In addition to all your little practices, everything that you do, start looking for points of attention. You're probably going to forget, and that's okay. We will forget, and then we will remember. We will forget, and then we will remember. And then someday, I can almost assure you, as long as we're not leaking power and getting down on ourselves, which is where a lot of anxiety can actually come from too, but T will start to address that in the counterbalance phase. We'll start looking at leaking power thoughts right away. That needs to be redirected. Otherwise, you're passively punching yourself in the face. You're just letting yourself do it, and that makes no sense. That's insane. So we redirect it back to the present moment, back to spirit, back to connection, back to flow. And so now, whenever she is going into a situation, she knows that's a battleground. She's going to rule of 3 before the battleground, create a strong point of attention, and maybe she'll forget the moment she gets in the room. And then she goes into the anxious state a little bit, and then she brings it back. That's counterbalance, folks. You will remember it until you forget it, and that's just the way it is. We're not used to doing it, so of course we're going to forget. And sometimes it feels like work. So sometimes we complain and talk ourselves out of our practice because of what we call the atrophy effect. So with social anxiety, we now have looked at it through 2 lenses of the T practice and all 3 lenses of the human experience: mind, psychology, body, biology, and spirit, the infinite. Does that make sense? All right, so let's just go a little bit further. And now we're going to go down to Karen. And Karen has really been practicing. She's really, every time she finds herself in a situation that she's forgotten, she doesn't beat herself up. She's like, there it is again. Where's my mind, and did I put it there? Fine, back to my practice. And she's been redirecting, she's been embodying, she's been doing her practice as often as she can remember. And now she's starting to get into that warrior training mode, where now we are really stepping up the responsibility and accountability factor. No cherry picking in warrior training. But Karen is wanting to get some shit done in her life. So she really wants to accumulate personal power. Well, that's just do energy. And we have an equation in warrior training for that. P1 plus a smooth breath times P2 plus whatever you're doing will automatically divide resistance, or resistance will automatically divide by those things to equal more flow in our life experience. So we have an equation for that, and we have identified streams of thought that never serve us, especially when we start to give it, I don't want to say too much energy, because almost any energy is too much energy. We don't need to compare and contrast. We don't need to constantly engage psychological time. We don't need to try to figure it out. We don't need to sit here and constantly think about our wants and our desires. We don't have to do that. We don't have to constantly put ourselves in these imaginary scenarios where we're actually just indulging ego and self-importance. We keep imagining these scenarios of us punching, the boss. Finally, he gets what he does. And that's not benefiting us. That's not benefiting the boss. We're completely removed from the present moment when we're imagining those fake scenarios. And even worse, you might create that one day. You might just punch him because you've been imagining it. So, and then you're like, oh my God, did I do that? That's a Freudian punch. You let it slip. So, but Karen, no, she's been practicing. She's been embodying the practice. She's been using the rule of 3 anytime those dysfunctional forms of cognition occur. So now she wakes up and she engages her T practice. Smooth breath, maybe laying down, 4 modes, and she immediately finds a point of attention to start taking with her throughout the day. Now she is forgetting way less. So throughout the day, she is remembering almost all of the time, with occasional forgetting. You know, maybe things start to move around and we're like, oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. I started to feel, and if you're starting to use the term starting to feel, now we're starting to get closer to seers training. But in the warrior training, we're just really clear on all these thoughts that do not serve us, these streams and directions of cognition that serve no purpose. So why would I start thinking about what Shane is thinking, about what Carly's thinking, about what the world is doing, about what they should be doing, about what they shouldn't? All of that is a violation of warrior training. It's trying to control, comparing and contrasting, trying to figure it out. We're violating the perception of the hawk. We're doing it in an imbalanced way. We're disconnecting ourselves from spirit, which is just going to charge all of the dysfunction, because now the mind is going to follow the spirit. If the spirit is imbalanced, the mind and the body will be unbalanced. It's the way it is. Spirit first. We're spirits in terms of the tiniest of tiny before we're the macro. We're still always the micro, if that's an okay way to put it. So the idea now is that we have this third phase of the T practice where now we're really watching our cognition. And I can almost guarantee you at this point, social anxiety, forms of depression, forms of anger, hate, jealousy, frustration, boredom is starting to dissolve. If you're charging spirit and the world around you, everything begins to flow. You don't feel stagnant. You feel everything moving. It's vibrant. It's new. It's fresh. I don't have to worry because I'm here. I have arrived. My mind feels very light. My body, I can feel the energy flowing through it. My points of attention are active. My golden line is aligned, so I can feel the alignment and feel the balance in my life experience. Now, anxiety is really on its way out the door. It's not getting the energy it needs to exist because our spirit is so balanced and connected, our cognition starts to follow that. Now, all of a sudden, the mind has ideas, has creative ways to express itself, has aha moments that we write down, or maybe we tell a friend. Maybe when somebody is complaining, we find the compassion necessary to just listen, to not try to change them, to not try to convince them of something else because we know better. We start to tend to our garden, but we still allow other people, the space that they need to exist too, because it's about moving and communicating and adapting. So before we know it, we find ourselves more caring, more compassionate, not in a hurry or rush necessarily. We can still move quickly when we need to, but our pace is deliberate. The mind is deliberate. The emotional output is deliberate. Happiness, probably a whole lot more than anything else. Sheer joy and just a sense of, this is all right. Like, everything is all right. So this starts to become a feeling in our experience the more we're doing this practice. And at this point in warrior training, anxiety is the more we do our practice, of course, we have to remember accountability, responsibility and accountability, and that's all you. I ain't got nothing to do with accountability for you. Even if I tell you about it, you still have to do it. You still have to hold yourself accountable for this practice and charging spirit with your attention. Whether it's inside your body or outside of your body, paying attention to it charges the spirit, charges the energy of it. Attention, where it goes, all that energy flows because we're charging the now moment with the flashlight of our attention. That's just a way of talking about things, just a way of looking at it. So does that make sense so far? The person with social anxiety, we got a place to start. We got some things to move. So as we move through basic alignment, counterbalance to warrior seers, we change the balance from the mind and the body and the spirit, all based on practice. Exactly. All based on the third pillar. That's really it. That's all we're doing. That's charging spirit, reconnecting to our life happening now. And the more we do that, the less we can think all of that cognition that creates the anxiety. And the more that we're feeling connection to the moment, the less we're feeling anxious from a spirit that is imbalanced, because the spirit is now balanced. So we start to feel more joy. We start to feel more essence and connection, and probably, at least at times, a lot of magic that does occur. The magic just starts to occur where you're looking at things in a brand new way. And it's freedom, because you don't need anything anymore to feel that. You know, you're creating your own emotional state. Because remember, as Abraham said, it's not the things and stuff that you want, it's the feeling from the things and stuff. Well, we have actually learned how to create the feeling of vibrancy and loving connection to our life experience without any things and stuffs, without any conditions necessarily. And when we're in a situation that we don't prefer, we adapt. And that's freedom as well, because now we're adaptable. We're free to move. We're free to change with change, even when it's something that is uncomfortable. You know, maybe Gene's electricity goes out and it gets really cold in the house. He's going to have to adapt, and it could be a little uncomfortable. And welcome to the universe. It's not always a comfortable place. And, you know, free from attachments, you know, and all connection. So, you know, we're making a connection to everything. And I don't know about free from all attachments, because I've already created this spider's web. Sometimes gurus and religions and ideologies, they're wanting to dissolve that web, to wipe it away somehow. So Gene created 30 years of psychological suffering, or 50 years, or 70 years, or 80 years of psychological suffering. And I'm not so sure that that ever completely goes away. Not completely. Like, that will be something that he may need to adapt to and change to as it occurs. And the T practice helps us free to move. So I'm not so sure that I'll ever be free from attachments. When my dog transitions to something new, I'm probably going to feel pretty sad. The idea of me transitioning to something, I'm attached to my own existence. And I just have to accept that and acknowledge that, and just continue to do my practice and charge spirit. So it's not necessarily, I don't know if I'm free, or I don't know if anybody is free from those types of things. You see what I mean? And definitely not free from connection. This is connection. That's what this is all about. The more we connect, the more we charge spirit in our experience, and it flows and it moves, and desire is expressed, and it's all a lot of just do energy and connection and feeling.
I didn't word that very well. I just meant free from attachments, and then connection is everything. That's what I meant. Sorry.
Oh, I see what you mean. That does make sense. Okay, yeah. So you're free. And I like the idea of free to move, you know, so that we can navigate these attachments. And that's balance. Because we're balanced, we can move, and we can, but I'm not so certain that we'll get to this absolutism, you know. Maybe, I don't want to put anybody in a box. Eckhart Tolle, maybe he has removed himself from ego entirely. I don't want to speak for him, and I don't want to put him in a box. I haven't done that. I still find myself thinking about me sometimes, and I still you know, I'm still attached to my own existence. I know that to a certain extent, right? So so what Carly is saying is, so we're now free to move, and we're free from a lot of the, you know, attachments and the clinging and the psychological suffering. We're free from that, and all that's left is connection. A lot of connection to everything. And the cognition will start to follow that connection, to where now the cognition is like, oh, man, where has this been? Like, I'm just now, do you remember when you first started noticing the seasons? Did anybody, like, maybe you don't, but I remember, like, where has this been? Like, where has this good feeling of noticing spring or winter transitioning to spring, or spring transitioning to summer? Like, where did this, you know, groovy feeling of transition, where has it been? It's been there. That potential energy has always been around you. You just haven't been charging it with your attention, so you haven't been feeling it. But now it's there. All that makes sense so far? Now, this is a broad spectrum, right? So if somebody is feeling anxiety, this is a broad spectrum that we've worked with already, from just doing a little basic fox walking to doing some serious redirection to full embodiment all of the time. We're starting to build our second attention, or our background trick of attention. Does that make sense? All right, so we're going to go down to Jerry. And now let's say that Jerry all of a sudden starts to prefer deliberate attention. All of a sudden, where her mind is of vital importance, and she just starts to go for full embodiment. So she starts to create what I have come to call a background trick of attention. She's starting to remember her body in space and time. She's starting to remember points of attention, P2, almost all the time, with very little forgetting. Does that make sense? Now we're starting to get towards seer's training, because there's no more atrophy effect. She wants to do it. Once the mind is convinced of the benefits, and the mind becomes convinced when you experience the benefits, it's like, oh, like I can feel good. Like that's a choice. Okay. And the mind is like, feel good better. And then
Yeah.
I
I was going to just add that at one point, my actual state of being was anxious. And I didn't know the difference between anxious and feeling good. Like I thought, anxious was my natural state. But so when I started training, like you said, you're like, oh, this feels really good. Like this warm, fuzzy feeling of feeling relaxed and not having those thoughts running through your head. So yeah, when you start to feel that, you want to move forward and have more of that feeling. So yeah, in the seer's training, you want to do it because you really like that feeling.
Right. And the term background is because you're maintaining it while doing everything else. It will feel like a background. And that's why Gene added at least 2 degrees. So at least to a degree, Jerry, you're always feeling it. Whether you're in the shower, whether you're at the store, whether you're shopping, whether you are in some catastrophic event that's occurring around you, that means that you have a trick of attention. So I use the term background because we have background, which means foreground. Foreground is everything that you're doing, because you're not just sitting there all zened out. No, like you have to drive to work, and you have to pay bills, and you have to, well, I don't say you have to. You can do what you want, but whatever you're doing something. And so the doing something I have assigned to foreground, and background is you're always doing it. You're not remembering and forgetting anymore. So the background is your trick of attention. You have a trick of attention constantly. You're maintaining it, and it's like a hum in the background of everything else. It's always occurring. It's like the vibration when I touch the refrigerator, and it's like, oh, that I can feel that vibration of the refrigerator. Your trick of attention is always occurring like that, right? While you do everything else. It can still be occurring to degrees, don't get me wrong. You can still step up the intensity, but it is still always, at least to a degree, occurring. That's why I love background with at least 2 degrees. It's occurring. Now we're starting to get into seer's training. And now we can start to feel, way before we get to the anxious state, the pull towards the anxious state. The moment the mind starts to think about itself, you are going away from spirit. Does that make sense? So when we're in the seer's training, I don't need all these evaluations of thought, because almost all thought is just pointed at myself anyway. So now I can just go back to the practice. The moment I start to feel the pull towards anxiety, back to the practice. The moment I start to feel the pull to boredom, back to the practice. The moment I start to feel a little bit of anger or irritation from the dog barking, back to the practice. And now the practice is really starting to become based on feeling, and we're starting to set up those next 3 aspects of T that I call deliberate modulation, choosing how you want to feel. It's not going to be anxiety. That's typically not something that we're going to, oh, I can't, today I choose frustration. I just want to be frustrated as hell today. Yay. No, but no, that doesn't make any sense. That's just, so in the seers training, if we're still talking about anxiety, well, we're choosing vibrancy, we're choosing connection, we're remembering to stay connected. And I can almost assure you anxiety will not exist in your experience. I don't feel anxiety. When I start to feel that pull towards it, I rule of three. I'll go back to my practice. I'll do some deliberate breath and some deliberate points of attention. So yesterday I gave a little talk to my friend's company. And the talk was about anxiety and about workplace wellness. And I could kind of feel, oh, I've never done this before. Wait a second. I do this every day. I sit here and I fucking talk to you guys every single day. So what's the difference? You see, that is an example of the voice of power starts to, Ernest, what's the difference? Like, you can do that. Like, you're just talking. You're good at talking. So just stop trying to talk yourself out of what you're good at and just go be good at it, dumbass. That's my voice of power talking to me now. It's a little bit cheeky, so your voice of power doesn't have to be like that. But mine will just call me out and just be like, oh, come on. Like, you're good at talking. Just go talk. So I could start to feel that pull towards, oh, and then I immediately go back to my practice. The voice of power emerges. I redirect using the rule of three if necessary, and I'm still doing my practice. Still engaging and aligning spirit. When my spirit is aligned, everything will start to follow the direction of that energy. And so my mind will start to follow the direction of that energy. And then so will my biology. My body will start to feel better. I'll feel more peace internally. Maybe I don't feel perfect, and that's okay. It's not a problem psychologically. So sometimes our body is just not going to be at 100%. It needs to counterbalance. It needs to use energy sometimes. We have an immune system, and that's using energy. So that happens.
Yeah, your body gives you signals that you don't have to respond. You don't have to panic. You don't have to do anything about it. You can observe it and move on. Or take action
Exactly.
if required.
Yep. So if we were going to look at anxiety and somebody is interested in the T practice, well, it really depends on how much exposure to T they've had so far, but we can always begin with basic alignment. Try a little fox walking when you're feeling anxious. Do something with your attention. Start to pay attention to the present moment on purpose. And so when we have the fox walking module, you can just go learn about that. Go do that. When we have the 4 modes module, just go do that. Deliberate driving, go do that. Any mindfulness practice that you've ever learned, go do that. Some yoga, okay, go do that. Go do something. Experience this mindfulness and anything. And so that would be basic alignment. I'm not going to really recommend, they haven't really asked me. Maybe they're not used to this practice. They don't really know what we're doing. So I'm not really going to start talking about the rule of 3 right away, because that's somebody's thinking. That's something that they need to do themselves. And first we feel mindfulness and what it can do. And then maybe somebody would be ready for the 4 factors of embodiment. Because when we go from basic alignment to counterbalance, counterbalance is an embodiment phase. The next 3 phases are embodiment. The first one is kind of like any amount of mindfulness will help. So just go do it. So if you're feeling social anxiety, if you're feeling these anxious states, there has to be something that we do that points back to the present moment and helps us engage it in some way. Maybe with 3 points of attention, maybe with 4 points of attention when we're feeling our most anxious, but there has to be something that we can do with our attention in the present moment happening now, because that's the T practice. And then a person that has been doing that, or maybe a person who, they've been doing other things and they really get it. They really understand what the hell we're talking about here. They get asset, this theory that we can place our attention wherever we want it, and they really get it, and they just immediately start to embody. And then that is the counterbalance phase, and that's when we start using the rule of 3, the 3-strike rule. And we really we're still forgetting, but we're remembering more often, more than before. And then when we start to remember more than forget, now we're ready for warrior training. And anxiety will not stand a chance in warrior training. You were really, yeah, you'll give that one a wallop. Because in warrior training, you're redirecting the thoughts, you're redirecting your attention, you have a lot of just do energy. It's very clear what you should be doing with your cognition according to the T practice to maintain balance, to observe the golden mean principle, and to be in the act of allowing by just directing our attention back to the third pillar. So does all that make sense? And then after that phase, you know, if you're in that warrior training, anxiety, you're going to be able to feel when you're going away from peace. And so when you can feel it, you can redirect it much quicker. And then before you know it, you can feel this thing that I call the hydrostasy effect, which is the feeling of balance. It's a bubble of perception that is very balanced, very clear. I don't know. It's difficult to describe to any satisfaction, but it feels like the opposite of anxiety, basically. The opposite of discomfort, the opposite of a spirit that is imbalanced. We've reverse engineered the dynamic. And now the virtues of T can become what we start to pay attention to. Does that make sense? And that can be quite magical, Ida. So from severe psychological suffering and anxiety to I don't even remember what that feels like. That's what the T practice can do. And so, you know, if you really want specific ways, well, we got to see where we are in these 4 phases. And specifically, if you're feeling anxiety, well, maybe we need to do some of the basic alignment stuff. You know, go for a walk. Talk to yourself in a way that will remind you of what you're doing and how anxiety doesn't serve you, how paying attention to the present moment, how it's beneficial and what it can do for us. Reminding ourselves of that, maybe having it on a note card, maybe rapid redirection, removing yourself from situations, maybe not putting yourself in certain situations. That would all be basic alignment. And then it can progress as this practice progresses. So this was a little bit about anxiety, and anxiety typically is going to be a future direction of cognition where we're thinking about a potential future, we're comparing and contrasting a potential future, we're violating the perception of the hawk, and we're thinking about what other people are thinking about. So now the light of our awareness is going into the potential of another person's awareness, which is so far down a rabbit hole, it's unbelievable. We're so disconnected from the world around us at that point that, of course, anxiety is going to be what we're feeling. We're disconnected from spirit to the nth degree at that point. That's very anxious, and it can feel depressed and anxious at the same time sometimes. So does that make sense? Any questions?
Our minds they can be hyper vigilant, can't they? And trying to keep us safe, that going in, shining the light in ourselves all the time. And it's just that DNA of prehistoric safety. It's interesting how it just gets so out of balance and extreme. It's nice to have tools.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting, but yeah, it's definitely occurring. And it is kind of interesting to see how that kind of thing happens. But just like we began with, it's ultimately because our spirit is unbalanced, because we're not paying attention to the present moment on purpose. We're not engaging it. Engagement implies deliberate nature. So we're just not doing it. And that creates the atrophy effect. And it creates states like anxiety, like depression, like anger and frustration, and just general moods of discomfort. And then the body starts to hurt physically. And then the psychology is increasing the physical discomfort, and then they're both feeding each other, and then before you know it, our life experience is so far removed from vibrancy and spirit that we don't even think it exists. We don't even think it's possible. And then we start to get into that pessimism, and it's all downhill from there. So this is reverse engineering that dynamic. And it's charging spirit. It's charging the essence of the present moment.
So when you get
All
new
right.
feelings,
Yes.
Ernest, new feelings, this is what I'm finding now in flashes. New feelings of, I can't really describe it, but it's a nice feeling. And in the past, I probably would have said that's a one-off, and you know, maybe not focused on that feeling. Where now I can see that focusing on that new good feeling, and it's always new, something different, is a good thing to be at. Focusing on the good feeling is what you're talking about, really, isn't it? What Lisa said about focusing on your relaxed brain. Well, sometimes when I get a really good feeling, I know now, looking at that and from past experience, I would have dismissed it as a one-off, or I would have tried to work out how I got to that good feeling and destroyed it by doing that, by analysing it. Where now I can just enjoy it and focus on it so that more comes, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah. And that is this practice. So, you know, one of the things that I will never prescribe to is that anxiety is just this thing that's separate from the mind and the body and the spirit, and that it's just something we have, you know, like my anxiety is high today, or I was diagnosed with anxiety. And, you know, I get it. It can be in the body. We can have body responses to it. But T is an embodiment approach, and it's empowering. So it means that we have to take responsibility for that creation. The anxious state is something we're creating. And when I say creating, I don't mean intentionally, right? It's the four destroyers. So these destroyers are basically helping to create the conditions for this anxiety and these anxious states. And we may be swimming in it often, but we're creating it. It's a machination of the direction of our minds and our attention, and now it's in our body, and that's feeding the mind further, that's feeding the body further, perpetuating it further and further and further. But that is still something that is our output. The emotion of anxiety, the hormonal response, the reactions that are occurring in our body as a response to a trigger, if that's the body response of a trigger, or the mind going off into the comparing and the contrasting and what are they thinking and how are they viewing me, invisible eyes of other people, we're doing that. We have to take responsibility for what we're doing. And that is what this practice does. That's what the four factors is really all about. It's saying that, oh, wait a second, I am not my anxiety. I am the light of attention itself, and anxiety is occurring in my body and in my mind as a result of something. And that's still my garden to tend to. So when we take accountability and responsibility for anxiety, we can begin to change it. We can begin to dissolve it. And I don't necessarily need a drug or some foreign substance to get rid of it. Now, there may be things that help. So I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe there are some natural plant remedies, some certain things like maybe a cinnamon tea, you know, a nice tea that smells good, and green tea is helping my energy. All right, so now we're using these physical tools in addition to connecting and doing our tea practice. That's fine. I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Hopefully you don't always need cinnamon tea to relax now. But if it helped you get to that and helped you get back to your practice, I'm not going to declare war on that. That's you and cinnamon tea. That's fine. But if you start taking X factor drug because you think it's going to cure your anxiety, you are mistaken. because the mind will continue to create the conditions for that anxiety because it is fundamentally and disproportionately not engaging and paying attention to the moment as it happens. And that creates a disconnection to spirit and energy and the world around us. And it's a terrible psychosis. Does that make sense? All right, so we will have other modules to add to our library where we'll discuss a little bit more what basic alignment is, what the other phases are. We have basic alignment, we have counterbalance, warrior training, seers training. Hydrostasy is where we're really maintaining our balance and we're able to move and kind of change with things as they're happening in really interesting ways. So, you know, I can talk about hydrostasy as well. But we will have modules on all of these other aspects too. So, you know, if we're going to talk about depression, we have to talk about the three: the mind, the body, and the spirit, starting really with the spirit. We address that. That's what this is. This is a practice that is helping us charge spirit with our attention. And then the spirit starts to flow between subject and object, between infinite and finite. And then all of a sudden our body is charged with this energy. All right, so there'll be more modules in air quotes because we're making a library. And so this one would really be titled, Where Does T Fit In with Anxiety? Well, T is a practice, so you're going to have to learn about that too. So there's no magic tricks. This is very easy to explain. It's very simple in its essence, but it can be very difficult to do because we've never done anything like it before, very likely. If we're brand new to this, we've very likely never done anything like this. Maybe if we've had a little bit of background and we've learned some things here and there, well, maybe we're all in. Let's go for full embodiment. And so we just jump straight in to maybe the counterbalance or the warrior training. Yeah, I like the modules library concept. So yeah, it won't be long, and we'll have a website that will have all of these little modules and videos, and maybe they'll just be sound, and it will really focus on this thing that we call substitute dialogue. Listening to this can help redirect unproductive cognition. All right, well, that's all I got for you guys today. Should be back with the podcast tomorrow at 6:15 as I drive to work if weather conditions are nice. If they're not, then I don't tempt fate. So if the weather is even a little bit not well, then I won't do the podcast. Safety first. So yeah.
Isn't this Wednesday?
What?
Is this Wednesday?
This is Wednesday. Yeah. So I'm back to work tomorrow. So
I'm sorry. No, this is all good. But I thought I remember you saying be ready for Wednesday because it's going to be 2 or 3 hours of